Madam Chair, that is the motion, and I bring it forward to expand the scope of the study that this committee is undertaking with respect to foreign election interference in light of the shocking Globe and Mail report last week written by Stephen Chase and Robert Fife that is reportedly based upon their review of CSIS documents that reveals that a sophisticated strategy on the part of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, to interfere in the 2021 election. The Globe and Mail report characterized the Chinese Communist Party's interference campaign in the 2021 election as, quote unquote, an orchestrated machine. The report of the Globe and Mail indicates that this sophisticated strategy, this orchestrated machine on the part of Beijing to interfere in the 2021 election had two overriding objectives. The first was to see that the Liberal Party was reelected with a minority government, and secondly, that certain conservative candidates deemed unfriendly to Beijing be defeated. According to the Globe and Mail report, a CSIS report quoted an unnamed Chinese Communist Party consulate official as saying, quote, "The Liberal Party is becoming the only party that the PRC can support," end of quote. This campaign of interference reportedly involved the active participation and coordination of Chinese Communist Party diplomats in Canada, including Beijing's then Consul General to Vancouver, Ms. Tong, along with another former Consul General to Vancouver, Wang Jin. According to the Globe and Mail, CSIS characterized the activities of Ms. Tong and Mr. Wang as being involved in an effort to, quote, discredit, that they were involved in efforts to discredit and to rally support for the Liberals and to target conservative candidates and to work to see those candidates defeated, and that Ms. Tong and Mr. Wang, among other methods, used CCP proxies to achieve those objectives. Ms. Tong reportedly even boasted in 2021 about how she helped defeat two conservative members of parliament, including an MP who she described as, quote, a vocal distractor, end of quote, of the Chinese Communist Party. The scope and sophistication of this reported campaign of interference is troubling in terms of its multi-dimensional approach that Beijing took that involved such tactics as funneling money to candidates through illegal, undeclared cash donations, having business owners hire international students on the basis that they were being hired to work for those businesses, when in fact they were being illegally paid to work for election campaigns on a full-time basis for certain Liberal candidates, that there were active disinformation campaigns specifically targeting Conservative candidates, and that there was collusion between political campaigns and this Chinese Communist Party foreign interference network. So let me repeat what is being reported to have happened. Illegal cash donations, disinformation targeted against Conservative candidates, collusion with Liberal candidates, the widespread use of proxies to advance the Chinese Communist Party's objectives of helping the Liberal Party and working to defeat certain Conservative candidates, all coordinated and directed by Chinese communist diplomats on Canadian soil. If these reports are true, and there is no reason to doubt the accuracy of these reports from the Globe and Mail, which were reported by two well-known, widely respected journalists, Robert Fife and Stephen Chase, this campaign of interference is not trivial. It is not a case of one or two bad actors, not that one or two bad actors is something to turn a blind eye to. But if established, what this amounts to is an all-out assault on Canadian democracy by the Chinese communist regime, and an effort that raises questions about the integrity of the election in 2021 in certain ridings targeted by Beijing. This should alarm every Canadian, and it most certainly should alarm those who are entrusted and have responsibility to protect Canada's democratic institutions, including the Prime Minister and his ministers. More than alarm, it should have prompted immediate action on the part of the government. But that did not happen, and 18 months, more than 18 months after the 2021 election, there is no evidence that any action has been taken by this Liberal government. There have been no charges laid, no diplomats expelled. The Conservative Party and Conservative candidates that were targeted by the Chinese Communist Party were not informed about this campaign of interference, that they were targets. Instead, they were kept in the dark, including by the government's election panel, the very panel that this government pats itself on the back for establishing, kept these candidates in the dark. And the government's election panel kept the Canadian public in the dark about this interference. Indeed, we would not have known about interference in the 2021 election but for the Canadian press, through access to information, obtaining reports that showed the rapid response mechanism at Global Affairs had identified interference activities and a disinformation campaign through proxies, through the use of social media platforms, targeting Conservative candidates, including then Member of Parliament, now defeated Member of Parliament, Kenny Chiu. But when it comes to this Prime Minister, I have to say it's worse than inaction. Since Global News first reported back in November about a vast campaign of interference by Beijing in the 2019 election involving at least 11 candidates, the Prime Minister has consistently failed to heed the advice that CSIS has provided him with respect to countering foreign interference. Advice that the Prime Minister received, for example, in a CSIS memo dated January 21st, 2021, that advised the Prime Minister as follows, that, quote, Canada can make use of a policy that is grounded in transparency and sunlight in order to highlight the point that foreign interference should be exposed to the public and clandestine practices are not equivalent to public diplomacy, end of quote. The Prime Minister has been anything but transparent. He has refused to answer basic questions about what he knows about Beijing's interference in the 2019 and 21 elections and when he first learned of that interference. He has deflected and engaged in political spin using, among other things, carefully crafted language, such as saying that he was not briefed about candidates receiving money from China, even though, based upon the briefing document that Global News reported back in November, no one was alleging that candidates received money from China, as if Beijing just writes a big, fat check to individual candidates, but rather what is at issue, is a reported vast campaign of interference in the 2019 election campaign, and now a vast campaign of interference in the 2021 election campaign. The Prime Minister, again, using carefully crafted words, talks about how the last two elections were not compromised, as if to say that anyone is alleging that those elections were compromised. That's a very different question than what appears to have happened, which was interference targeting certain ridings and certain candidates. The fact that the overall result of an election was not compromised does not negate the fact that there are serious issues of interference that may have had an impact on the outcome of the election in certain ridings. Canadians deserve to know why, in the face of this reported vast campaign of interference by Beijing, the Prime Minister and ministers in his government continue to obfuscate and downplay the seriousness of this interference and have failed to take any meaningful action to protect our democracy against this serious threat. It seems as if the Prime Minister is content to turn a blind eye to this interference because this interference benefited the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party. And so, in the face of the obstruction, the non-answers, the lack of transparency on the part of the Prime Minister, we have put, and in light of the very shocking new facts that have been reported about what happened in the 2021 election, it's important that in order to get to the bottom of election interference, that this committee expand the scope of its study, call in responsible ministers so that they can be asked questions, so that they can be held accountable, and so Canadians can learn what Canadians deserve to know, and that is about the scale and scope of Beijing's interference in the 2021 election campaign, and also to work to ensure that interference of the kind that has been reported, or any interference for that matter, is not repeated in future elections. And so I hope that this committee will move forward to pass this motion so that we can, as expeditiously as possible, expand the scope of the study and hold hearings. Thank you, Madam Chair.